back in Abilene.
The 1970s gave us some of the greatest albums in music history, masterpieces that defined entire generations. But not every record released in that golden decade struck the right chord. From the rise of punk to experimental studio ventures, some albums flopped so hard they shocked fans, critics, and even the artists themselves. Some failed because they were too ambitious, others because they arrived at the wrong time, and a few simply missed the magic altogether. Today, we're diving into the fascinating world of music missteps with 25 music albums from the 1970s that failed miserably. By the late 1970s, Black Sabbath were already icons of heavy metal, having carved out their reputation with dark, thunderous riffs that defined the genre. But with Never Say Die, their 8th studio album, the cracks in the band's foundation were impossible to ignore. Ozzy Osbourne had temporarily quit the band in 1977. Tensions were boiling over, and when he did return, the chemistry wasn't the same. The band tried experimenting with jazz elements and outside writers, straying from the heavy formula fans adored. Instead of sounding innovative, the record came off as confused and half-hearted. Fans who once worshipped Sabbath's heaviness felt betrayed, while critics dismissed it as muddled and uninspired. The result was a commercial disappointment that marked the end of an era. And speaking of ambitious bands that lost their way, our next story takes us to Yes and their sprawling experiment.
There's reasons not the killing, just take over.
Few bands embodied 1970s progressive rock like Yes. Fresh off the acclaim of Close to the Edge, they felt unstoppable. So, they pushed their creativity even further with Tales. From Topographic Oceans, a double album featuring just 4 epic tracks inspired by mystical Hindu texts. On paper, it sounded groundbreaking, but in practice, it overwhelmed almost everyone. The songs stretched endlessly, often meandering without payoff, leaving even devoted fans struggling to stay engaged. What should have been a bold step forward became a bloated exercise in excess, with critics slamming it as pretentious and even some band members later admitting it lacked focus. Though it charted respectably, many saw it as the moment progressive rock collapsed under its own weight. And as Yes stumbled with too much ambition, Aerosmith soon showed how chaos behind the scenes could ruin even a straightforward hard rock record. By the late 70s, Aerosmith were America's rock and roll bad boys. But behind the swagger, the band was falling apart. Recording Night in the Ruts was marred by heavy substance use, internal feuds, and guitarist Joe Perry walking out mid-session. With Perry gone, producers had to bring in session musicians to finish the job, leaving the album feeling fragmented and soulless. Instead of the raw fire fans loved from Toys in the Attic or Rocks, this record sounded like a tired band on autopilot. Critics called it uninspired, and sales were far below the band's earlier successes. For many fans, it marked the moment Aerosmith lost its edge. But while Aerosmith stumbled due to chaos within, Elton John's flop came from chasing a trend he was never meant to follow. Elton John spent most of the 1970s ruling the charts with timeless hits, but by the end of the decade, even superstars could make desperate moves. Victim of Love was Elton's attempt to jump onto the disco craze, a genre already showing cracks as Disco Demolition Night and the backlash against the style swept through America. Unfortunately, instead of blending disco with his usual flair, the album felt hollow and uninspired. Elton himself didn't even play piano on it, making it sound less like his work and more like a generic studio project. Critics tore it apart for lacking personality, and fans ignored it, sending it plummeting to some of the lowest chart positions of his career. This stumble proved that chasing trends rarely pays off. And just as Elton's misstep showed what happens when you abandon your identity, Humble Pie's collapse showed what happens when exhaustion robs a band of theirs.
I was just a kid back in Abilene. I had to use a gun where for my own sake.
Once hailed for their gritty blend of blues, soul, and rock, Humble Pie had the energy to captivate audiences. But by the time Street Rats came along in 1975, that spark was fading fast. The band was exhausted, drowning in label pressure and struggling with personal issues. Much of the album was pieced together without the band's full input, resulting in a patchwork of unfinished ideas and half-hearted performances. Fans who once loved their fiery energy were met with sluggish tracks that felt tired and uninspired. Critics noticed the decline immediately, calling the record unfocused and lackluster. Sales were poor, and it marked the beginning of the band's slow fade from relevance. The next entry shows how even wildly creative ideas from big names could collapse spectacularly when pushed too far.
I wake up before I put on my makeup.
At this point, Aretha Franklin was trying to shift gears. La Diva was released in September 1979, with heavy disco and R&B overtones, produced by Van McCoy among others, as she attempted a comeback. But disco was already getting backlash, and critics felt McCoy's production was trite and overbearing. It often masked Aretha's strengths rather than showcasing them. Even though she had 3 self-written songs on the album and her voice was still powerful, the record sold poorly and charted much worse than her previous works. It ended up being the lowest-selling album in her Atlantic catalog. The flop signaled both a stylistic gamble gone wrong and bad timing, and set the stage for more covers-driven albums that similarly failed to connect, like the next entry.
We own the summer hand in hand, Joanna.
Scott Walker was once known for deeply personal, original material, but The Moviegoer, released in October 1972, changed all that. It has 0 original songs made up entirely of film-themed covers. After several albums that didn't do well commercially or critically, Walker essentially lost control over what his label wanted. A safer, more marketable record rather than something bold. Because of that, The Moviegoer failed to chart and was forgotten almost as soon as it hit stores. Its failure was rooted in both a lack of strong material and a mismatch between what listeners expected of Walker and what the album delivered. This lost period of his career continued through several more flops, such as the one following, which also didn't help his momentum.
You were standing in the rain, you waved goodbye.
Before his so-called lost years, Walker released Till the Band Comes In December 1970, a record that already showed cracks in his momentum. He mixed original songs with covers of standards and more pop-friendly material, under pressure from his label to be more commercial after Scott IV underperformed. But that compromise hurt. The album didn't resonate with his core fans who liked his depth, and didn't attract new listeners either. It failed to chart. Negative and mixed reviews called it uneven and half-hearted. This record cemented the start of Walker's slump.
Person up at all? You find that quite hard to handle?
No, it was a relief for me. For some other people, I don't know, you'd have to ask.
Following The Moviegoer, Walker dropped Any Day Now in May 1973. Another album full of covers with no original material. The idea must have been that familiar songs would make it easier to sell, but instead it undercut what people liked most about him. His songwriting, his originality. The same pattern, lack of creative input, catering to safety rather than risk, made this album feel unremarkable. Consequently, Any Day Now also failed to chart, receiving little attention compared to his older, more innovative work. The disappointment of this and previous albums left Scott Walker in creative limbo, opening the door for more high-profile artists whose experiments would equally misfire, like Lou Reed coming up next.
Jackie is a banker, baby, and Jane, she is a clerk.
Lou Reed was famous for pushing boundaries, but the Bells, 1979, stretched them in ways many felt simply didn't work. He collaborated with free jazz trumpeter Don Cherry and others, experimented with binaural sound effects, and abandoned much of his earlier grit. However, critics and fans largely felt the album was unfocused and uninspired. Some tracks were praised, but many said the overall mood dragged. The experiments didn't translate well onto vinyl, and the production felt unfriendly. In sales and chart performance, it underperformed his more popular previous efforts. Singles didn't hit big, and the album quickly faded from prominence. Lou Reed's misstep here shows that even daring experiments need some grounding, which leads us to the next flop from a legend trying to stay relevant in changing times.
Thank you. Now I'd like to slow things down a bit here at this juncture and play something which is off the Wildlife album, which is called Wildlife.
After the Beatles broke up, fans expected Paul McCartney to deliver nothing less than brilliance with his new band, Wings. But when Wildlife arrived in 1971, many were left scratching their heads. McCartney rushed the recording. The entire album was done in just a week, because he wanted it to feel raw and spontaneous. Unfortunately, it came across more like sloppy and unfinished. Critics tore into it, saying the songs lacked structure and polish, and the album's experimental vibe didn't live up to Paul's genius reputation. Fans were equally puzzled, and while it sold decently due to McCartney's name, the reviews were so brutal that it damaged Wings' early credibility. And if Paul stumbled this badly so soon after the Beatles, imagine how another legend like Bob Dylan fared with his own misfire.
In 2012, a tape was found containing mixdowns of what would become Bob Dylan's self-portrait album.
Bob Dylan shocked everyone in 1970 with Self-Portrait. Instead of delivering another poetic masterpiece, he gave the world a double album filled with odd covers, lazy renditions, and half-baked originals. Critics were baffled. Dylan later admitted he made the album deliberately messy, hoping to push fans away from the prophet image they'd created around him. But instead of rebellion, it just sounded like a giant mess. The record sold well initially, thanks to Dylan's name, but the backlash was severe. Many fans felt betrayed, thinking he no longer cared. If Dylan's failure was about frustrating expectations, the next flop came from an icon who tried too hard to chase trends. David Bowie was on fire in the early 70s with his Ziggy Stardust persona, reinventing himself as a cosmic rock star. But in 1973, instead of following up with another groundbreaking original, he released Pin-Ups, an album of covers from the 60s. Bowie's aim was to pay tribute to the music that inspired him, but critics felt it was more filler than fire. The glam rock flair was there, but the emotional punch wasn't. Fans wanted more Bowie magic, not reheated versions of old hits. While the record sold in the UK, it was received coolly elsewhere, and many considered it a step backward in his otherwise bold career. Still, Bowie would bounce back quickly. Not all artists were so lucky. Just ask John Lennon, whose mid-70s return album didn't exactly thrill listeners. When John Lennon and Yoko Ono dropped some time in New York City in 1972, they wanted to make a political statement. The album tackled feminism, racial inequality, and even U.S. prison conditions. While the passion was there, the execution wasn't. Critics complained that the lyrics were too blunt, reading more like newspaper headlines than poetry, and the music felt rushed and uninspired. Fans who expected the emotional depth of Imagine were stunned at how clunky and heavy-handed this album sounded. Commercially, it flopped hard, peaking low on charts compared to Lennon's earlier work. It's often cited as one of the weakest solo Beatles releases. And while Lennon's flop was political, the next one, from Fleetwood Mac, was pure chaos behind the scenes.
Rhiannon rings like a bell through the night.
Fleetwood Mac's Kiln House was released in 1970, right after founder Peter Green's sudden departure due to mental health struggles and substance use. The band tried to regroup, with Jeremy Spencer and Danny Kirwan stepping up to fill the void. But without Green's vision, the album felt uneven. It awkwardly bounced between rockabilly throwbacks and psychedelic jams, with no real identity tying it together. Critics were lukewarm, and fans who expected the bluesy power of earlier Mac were disappointed by this stylistic confusion. Sales were modest, but the record clearly showed the band was in transition, searching for direction.
The stars have lost their glitter. The wind grows colder.
In 1973, Cher took a bold swing with Bittersweet White Light, and let's just say, it didn't exactly hit the mark. The album was a collection of old pop standards, reimagined with lush, dramatic arrangements. Think of it as Cher stepping away from her chart-friendly pop and diving headfirst into the world of show tunes and torch songs. On paper, it sounded glamorous. In reality, fans were left scratching their heads. People loved Cher for her sharp, modern edge, not for covering songs their parents grew up with. Critics weren't impressed either, calling it out of touch and overly theatrical. Sales? Pretty dismal. It barely made a ripple on the charts. Simply put, Bittersweet White Light failed because it was too far removed from what her audience wanted. But hey, even icons like Cher stumble sometimes. The Beach Boys tried to stage a comeback with 15 Big Ones in 1976, promoted as Brian Wilson's big return after years of personal struggles. Fans expected a masterpiece, maybe something on par with Pet Sounds. Instead, half the album was covers, and the original material felt weak and uninspired. Critics slammed it as lazy and unfocused, saying Wilson wasn't ready to fully lead again. While the album sold reasonably well due to hype, fans were deeply disappointed. For many, it confirmed that the band's golden age was truly over. And if the Beach Boys' flop was about nostalgia gone wrong, the next disaster came from a rock pioneer trying to reinvent himself in ways no one asked for.
I got the wiggles in my knees when she looked at me and sweetly smiled.
Chuck Berry's Rocket, released in 1979, holds a strange place in history. It was his last studio album for over 3 decades. By this point, Berry's influence on rock was undeniable, but Rocket showed a legend struggling to adapt to modern sounds. The production felt dated, the songwriting uninspired, and critics panned it as a weak send-off. Fans who grew up with his fiery 50s rock and roll were disappointed to hear such a lukewarm effort. While Berry still commanded respect as a pioneer, the album itself quickly disappeared from conversation.
It's time welcome now for that top 4 with their top hit, You Really Got Me Going, The Kinks.
Ray Davies always had a flair for theatrical storytelling, but with Preservation Act 2, he may have taken it too far. This 1974 double album was part of a sprawling rock opera concept, continuing from Preservation Act 1. Unfortunately, the execution was bloated. Critics blasted it for being overly complicated, with too much narrative and not enough strong songs. Fans, used to catchy Kinks hits like Lola, didn't know what to make of the political satire and long-winded plot. The album flopped commercially, with audiences walking away from the ambitious but confusing project. While the Kinks' misstep was theatrical excess, the next flop came from an artist who went the opposite direction, focusing on minimalism that just didn't work. Few albums in history are as infamous as Lou Reed's Metal Machine Music. Released in 1975, it was essentially an hour of screeching guitar feedback split across 4 sides of vinyl. Reed claimed it was an avant-garde masterpiece. Others suspected it was a giant middle finger to his record label. Critics and fans were stunned. Some called it unlistenable, others returned the album demanding refunds. It sold poorly and was quickly pulled from many record stores. Over time, some avant-garde circles have reevaluated it as groundbreaking, but in the 1970s, it was a commercial disaster.
There might have been things I missed.
By 1978, ELP was almost a legend in prog rock, but Love Beach came out like a drop in their momentum. The band was contractually forced to record and tensions were high. Greg Lake and Carl Palmer left before Keith Emerson finished much of the work. They also dramatically shifted toward softer, radio-friendly pop rock, short accessible tunes, even giving the album a beachy cover that looked more disco-era than ELP. Critics hated it. Fans felt betrayed. It didn't sound like the band people loved. It charted weakly and is often called their most disappointing album. This failure shows how anything can go wrong when pressures mount. Now, let's see an artist whose flop was more about image and identity. Sparks had built a quirky, cultish fan base with offbeat pop and clever lyrics. With introducing Sparks, they tried to adopt a new American sound, something glossier, more radio-friendly. But that shift felt forced. Listeners who loved their eccentricity and wit found the album bland. The production gloss couldn't hide songs that lacked the spark, pun intended, of their earlier work. The record was a commercial failure. Critics reacted negatively, many saying the band lost its essence trying to chase mainstream appeal. Because the identity was diluted, it never charmed old fans or won many new ones. And when image fails, momentum fades fast, something Gene Clark discovered with his next misfire.
Move once again. Put your face into the wind.
Gene Clark, formerly of the Byrds, put his heart and art into no other. He tried for something grand. Lush production, deep emotional lyrics, big arrangements. But the label didn't promote it well. The cost was high, and the sound was so over the top that many at the time called it bloated and pretentious. It only peaked at number 144 on the Billboard charts. People didn't get it, or maybe they weren't ready. Over time, no other has gained cult status, but in its moment it failed to connect with commercial or critical fans. And speaking of albums that were initially dismissed, let's talk about one that everyone hated at first.
Ghost Rider, motorcycle hero.
This debut from the band Suicide was primitive, raw, minimalistic. Synths, repetitive rhythms, bleak urban noise. When it came out in late 1977, many in the US were bewildered. It failed to chart at all. Critics weren't kind. Fans were too niche. It was so far removed from what was popular that it just didn't stand a chance commercially. But the weird thing is, its influence exploded later. Electronic, punk, and experimental scenes would point to it. So its initial failure was a matter of being too ahead of its time. For our last entry, another brilliant but underestimated artist released a flop that proved more tragic than experimental. Big Star's #1 record is heartbreaking in this story. Packed with melodies, harmonies, classic songwriting, but plagued by bad luck. The record label didn't distribute it well. It got almost no promotion. Radio barely played it. Even though singles like 13 are now classics, at release, it sold poorly and was largely ignored by the mainstream. Critics liked some parts, but without commercial muscle behind it, it slipped away. It's become a cult favorite, admired by artists, but it was one of the biggest flops of its moment.